I'm joined by Dr. Lorcan Sirr, and I really appreciate you coming in. What I'm hoping is we can have a chat around what your view is on property and where we're at.
Yeah.
So you're lecturing in TUD, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm there. To my surprise, I was there 21 years a couple of weeks ago. I thought those years go by very quickly. And most of that time, I started off in commercial property and valuations and planning and development, and now I mostly do housing. Okay.
So just give me, if we jump straight in, what do you think of the state of the property market in Ireland right now?
Well, people think it's something really unusual, and it's we've never seen anything like this before. Actually, it was the same in the 30s, same in the 60s. I go back and for my sins and my job, I have to read all debates, and I read them from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever. And in the 60s, they're talking about, why are we building hotels and offices instead of houses? In the 30s, they're talking about we can't afford to build social housing because it's too expensive. You could just change the dates, and it could be 2023. So we've been here many times before. Which says something about our inability to learn, from past experiences.
The one thing that man learns from history is that man doesn't learn from history.
Exactly, yeah. And I suppose the difference this time around is that there are many more global players in the market than there were, back in the 60s. Like, we were insular until the 70s or 60s or 70s, but now there are many more global players in the market in terms of financing and also, delivery of mostly apartments. So that's a different, but the principles of a crisis, or I've given up calling it a crisis, just a housing failure, are, the same as.
It's interesting though. So we have been here before. The problems are similar or the same.
Yeah.
But I did some maths on it, and yes, I took a very specific case, and I looked at it, and it was in my second book, I think it was, where I looked at it and said, okay, someone in the mid-90s trying to buy a house versus someone trying to buy it today. And the book was written 2-3 years ago, so it's out of date still. Yeah. But I did find that in my mathematical calculation, it was harder to buy a home now than it was then. Do you think it is?
It is. And there have always been affordability issues.
Yeah.
And it wasn't connected to the price of the house. Was more connected to wages and rents back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Now it's much more, your salaries have divorced or separated increasingly from the price of housing. So it is. It's harder, all right, but there was arguably more options back in the 50s and 60s. For example, back in those days, councils built private houses, and you got your mortgage from the council. When my dad died, I went through his box of tricks at home, and I found the deeds to the first house, and he bought it from Kildare County Council, and he got the mortgage from Kildare County Council. And that was all, and it was all affordable and all that kind of stuff. And now, really where things started to go awry in terms of wages and house prices was in the 70s, when we let the banks give mortgages. Prior to the mid-70s, banks weren't allowed to give out mortgages. And of course, as soon as you do, they're joined. They just see a huge market there, and they're outbidding each other, giving Owen more money than Lorcan, more money than Owen. And you see house prices rocket. So, and you see the same in the UK. We are no different to the UK. The same stuff in the early 70s. The deregulated mortgage market like we did, and the same divergence in salaries versus house prices.
It's interesting you say that up until the 70s it was the government who was giving out the loans. I was actually doing a pre-budget special with Claire Byrne last week, and it was a thought that came to my head when they were talking about helping mortgage interest or giving mortgage interest relief to people. And this was pre-budget, so we didn't know what they were actually going to do. And I blurted out on air, I said, look, really, government should go into lending out money. And that's the way, this is one of the solutions to this problem. And then I had to roll it back and say, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm probably going to get hammered on Twitter for that one later on, because I just let that come off my tongue. It's just, I haven't given that a whole lot of thought.
That's what we used to do. And we used to let councils borrow money. Like at the heart of a lot of our housing problems is the fact we don't have social housing, right? And I know a lot of people think, well, that's not relevant to my situation. Well, it is, because what we've done, instead of having people being able to house people in social housing or council housing, we've housed them in the private rental sector. That's, taken up an awful lot of supply that was there. Rents have gone through the roof, then people are stuck there, and at the same time we're not building a huge amount of houses. So at the root of a lot of our problems is the fact we don't have enough council houses. There's 50-something, 6,000 households, not people, households waiting for a council house, which will, I suspect, never be. We'll never kind of house all those people. There will always be a big waiting list. But that's at the root of it. That kind of problem. And we used to let councils borrow money to build them, and we used to let them off and just do it. Now it's all command and control. They can't borrow money. They have to go to the Department of Housing 4 times for approval for one scheme, for example, and it's delaying everything. So, councils used to have a lot more autonomy, and now it's all been centralised, and planning and housing back into the custom house.
And it's interesting when you think about that, because as you said there, that's not relevant to me. Social housing doesn't have any impact to me. But sometimes people struggle to put that connection together, the steps of the ladder. So, they're building €800,000 houses around the corner. What use is that to a first-time buyer? That's because the second-time buyer has moved from their 300 or 400,000 house into that 800,000, and it's all freeing up stock beneath it as people move up the ladder.
Yeah.
But you're saying as well, with social housing frees up the other kinds of demands.
More, and it frees, what the problem is that we've so many, I think about 50,000 odd people tenancies in HAP and things like that, and ultimately they should be housed by the state, actually ultimately what we have is our concept of social housing is very interesting. It's only for those in most need. You go to somewhere like I was with some people from Vienna and Germany there the other day. You go to Vienna, you and I would be living in public housing along with the ex-Prime Minister and along with the taxi driver and the butcher, baker and everybody else, because their concept of public housing isn't what we call residualised. It's not just for the worst off, it's for everybody. And you put your name on the list in Vienna when you're 18 and you'll wait an average of 19 months to get your
Wow.
And they subsidise it. This is the thing. They think that, I know listeners will be thinking, they're some sort of communists or something. They don't. They subsidise really heavily developers to build apartments for them. So they build about 7,000, in Vienna alone, about 7,000 apartments a year. And they subsidise them really heavily. But they don't just hand the money to the developers. They say, okay, you're getting 70 grand an apartment, but they have to be this size, that to be what we call gender friendly. That sounds a bit bonkers, but no dark corridors, no dark car parks, maximum 5 stories, so that if your kids are playing in the courtyard, you can shout down to them and say, hey,
dinner's ready.
Tobias, your dinner is ready. yes, all that kind of stuff. But that's all, they make really good design, and everybody wants to live in them because they're so well designed and so well managed. And here it's, that kind of idea has been residualised.
Yeah, interesting you say that, because what you described, it's not a housing crisis, it's a housing failure. There's a good example of a place that it works in.
Yeah.
Where are our biggest failures here? What is our biggest problem? Why is it so difficult on people to be able to buy or to get their own home?
Okay, well, firstly, housing policy it's not, very little housing policy as far as I can see has any decent evidence behind it. It's kind of horse trading between government departments, particularly like deeper in finance and housing as to what budget you'll get, and then horse trading between industry and the department as well. And that's because we rely on the market, so therefore you have to talk to the market and see what they want. And, those kind of compromises, they end up solving very much a problem for developers and for those people. And I'm not anti-developer at all. You need these people. But it doesn't necessarily create the kind of housing that we need. We need family homes to buy. Instead, we're getting tens of thousands of very small apartments to rent, And I can see it in the numbers. People are leaving the large urban areas, particularly Dublin. So first-time buyers in Dublin City buying new housing in the last 5 or 6 years is down over 70%.
Wow.
It's up over 200, nearly 220% in what I call the Middle East, the Mid-East. So the greater Dublin area, the Kildares, including Louth, all the Meads, that's where people are flooding to. And actually going further to Longford and Mullingar even now. It's
down by 70%. First-time buyers buying in Dublin City is down by 70%.
In Dublin City,
and outside in the connecting counties, it's up by, what did you say?
It's 215%.
Wow.
So they're moving out farther. And actually, those figures, since I got them, which was about 6 months ago, it's now into Longford and Mullingar. And the problem there is, of course, because now this is why Eamon Ryan goes mad, public transport doesn't suit all these people, right? So they're buying another 2-litre 10-year-old 3 Series BMW, polluting fumes into the air, all that kind of stuff, and they're driving into work.
Yeah.
Or in some situations, they in a heteronormative household, just use this as an example, right? He'll cycle down to the train station, leave the bike there and get into work. She does the heavy lifting typically, and this is fact based, it's not opinion or anything like this, we have evidence for this. She will drop the kid off to the creche, the mother-in-law's in the school, and then no public transport suits her at that time, so she drives into work. Yeah. The biggest rise in single car occupancy is women on their own driving into Dublin City. So that's contradictory to what Eamon Ryan wants then, if you know what I mean, in terms of emissions and more transport and less transport.
And how do you fix that though?
Well, I think like the last time we had a housing mess, a real one, we've always had a housing mess, a real one like 2006, 2007, 2008, we built the right types of housing, as in housing for sale, in the wrong locations all over the country. Okay. Now we're building the wrong type of housing, which I would argue is small units for rent in all the right locations. And I think this obsession with high-rise apartment development is absolutely nonsense. It's sustainable locations, but A, they're not sustainable to build, and B, they're not sustainable in terms of tenure because people don't want them. They want to own the properties because that's our wealth. Over nearly 70% of our wealth for every man, woman and child in the country is our housing. You won't find it in your PTSB app, but we're all worth about €165,000. But you will find it in your house. And, providing high-rise, small, single aspect, narrow corridor apartments for people to rent isn't what they want. And they're the proof of the pudding is in the fact they're all moving into the.
But these developers, if we blame the developers for this, right?
Well, I don't blame the developers.
Blame is the wrong word. Yeah, but these developers are building these because they know they can rent them out or they can sell them. They're not stupid either. So why are they doing it?
No. Oh, well, they're doing it because they're let do it. I don't really blame the developers. The developers are free market agents. They're doing what they're let do. So the question then is who lets them do this? And the answer is that the basically planning policymakers in the Department of Housing have rolled over and said and Eoin Murphy lifted the height cap, for example. People, often economists will say, we should build high, that'll make housing cheaper. Building high doesn't make housing cheaper. It makes it more expensive because it's expensive to build that. And also, the more units you can put on a site, the more expensive that site is. So if I have a site and I can put 50 apartments on it, it's worth $1 million, we'd say, right? Yeah. If I can put 250 on it, it's worth 5 or 6 million.
Yeah.
And then, so that means somebody has to pay 5 or 6 million for that site before they start paying for the construction costs. And then the rent or the sales price, whatever comes out the other end, is going to be commensurately more expensive. So building high, it doesn't make anything cheaper. What the Department of Housing themselves came out and said, they did a study and said 6 stories is the optimum height. And I would agree with that.
Right, okay.
You go to Spain, you go to France, you don't see high-rise in Paris. You go to France, you go to Spain, 6 stories is very normal, and you have your Chinese supermarket, your bed shop, your doctor's surgery, your bar on the ground floor, and they have 2,000 people living in the 5 or 6 stories above them who service them all the time. Yeah. And that's Spain all over, Yeah. And it works really well. Instead, we've gone, we do flip-flop from extremes of the worst to extremes of from one extreme to the other, essentially. One-off houses all over the country, and next thing we're into, very high, dense, high-rise apartments.
Talk to me about the demand and supply issue. So what is the demand for new housing, new homes in Ireland in a given year?
Yeah, really tricky question, because you'll find, I think predicting the amount of houses that we need every year is basically finger in the air stuff, right? Because you can calculate using all the demographics that you want, and then something like Ukraine happens. And they're not even counted in our demand. But who could foresee that was going to happen?
Yeah, fair.
So there's always going to be things that happen that are out of our control, particularly as we get more globally connected. So who knows is the answer, what the demand is.
Could you keep it as simple as, the year I did the Leave Insert, there was 67,000 of us did the Leave Insert that year, right? And the way I look at it is you kind of put, I'm a little bit gone past my Leave Insert days, but if you roll forward Leave Insert today to 15 years later, that's kind of bringing it to early 30s, right? Those 67,000 people need to buy, they all hit 33 years of age at the same time, and imagine that's the magic age they're going to buy. If we only provide 20,000 houses, there's 47,000 of those didn't get their house in the year they wanted to, or should have, or could have, or whatever normally would have.
We're never going to build enough houses for people for lots of reasons. One, the capacity to do that. And two, I can tell you for the last 6 years, the amount of houses that we built every year has gone up over 100%, right? About 100%. So, 6 years ago, we were building 14, 15,000. Now we're building 30,000, allegedly. Well, we don't need to get into that debate, but say 30,000 last year. In the last 6 years, on average, only about 7,500 of those every year have come to the market. In other words, those new houses will appear in your local estate agent's window, right? So as the output has doubled, the amount of housing that comes to the market has gone from about half of all housing in 2017 to about 28% last year.
And what's happened to the other 72%?
Well, interesting. So social housing output has increased, which is great, because like we said a few minutes ago, we need loads of social housing. But apartment development has gone up from, I can't remember what it used to be, but it's up 414% in Dublin in the last 6 years. So all these apartments for rent have taken over sites where we should have had, I would argue, medium to high density housing, 2 and 3 story housing that, like they do in the Netherlands. Go to the Netherlands. Dublin to Galway and down south of that M6 is the size of the Netherlands, and it has 17.5 million people there. Wow. They don't have high rise. What they do have is really good density housing. So you won't have it'll be mostly terraced housing, but they'll have gardens and they'll have parking, but a bit of good design, and you can get an awful lot squeezed in. And the thing about the housing, of course, is much cheaper to build than apartments. So therefore, the sales price or whatever is also commensurately more affordable.
Have we got to a point, if you look at, when you think about Berlin, the last figure I have in Berlin is about 82% of people in Berlin rent. It looks like we are building up properties now that are going to be rented out. They're not going to be sold as units. Is it fair to say that, look, Dublin and Galway and Cork and Limerick and the big cities are just going to become more like European cities, and we're going to be renters in the city and owners outside the city?
I think it probably will. Whether it should happen or not is another thing, but I think that is probably going to happen, particularly in Dublin City. There's going to be an awful lot of renting for high earners, and the people then who work in your local Spar and butchers are going to be living in Mullingar and getting up at the crack of dawn to get in and driving mostly, So I think, probably will. There was a narrative for a good few years about we all need to rent. And they're government policy, and it's in the Housing for All, the government policy document. There's a huge emphasis on supplying private rental there. But they're willing to promote the supply of it, but they're not willing to give the security of tenure or affordability that also comes in Berlin that people forget about.
Yeah. That you can paint the walls and be there long enough to see it fade.
And the argument I hear all the time is, deregulation. There's too much regulation and therefore, landlords won't go into the market. Actually, you go to the countries with the highest levels of rental accommodation, particularly Switzerland, Germany, Denmark, they have the most regulation. They're the most regulated markets. So, it's not deterring landlords there. I think, honestly, though, we have a system here, a welfare system called asset-based welfare, and that's based on, we will help you buy your home and you're on your own after that, right? Pretty much, so you pay your health insurance, you pay expense of everything, right? But when you retire, your mortgage will be paid off and you can live on a modest state pension. That's the system. What happens when Eoin McGee hits 65 and he's renting and paying $2,200 a month, right? And his salary goes in half from his pension, okay? But the idea of that pension originally was that you wouldn't have to pay living costs when you hit 65, but you still do because you're renting, and you're going to turn to the state and say, help me. Yeah. And the state then, for years we're trying to get people to auto-enroll in pensions and all that. The irony then was, we'll be helping Eoin McGee pay his rent to an American pension fund. Yeah. And that money will go and rent tax-free to pay the Boston Firefighters Union pension fund as we struggle to support our own pensions here. So there's a twisted kind of a thing going on at the moment.
And what's the solution? So, okay, let's imagine you were given the levers here and you were told, look, you're in control now. You control, we will do. You've got full support from all these departments that are fighting with each other and horse trading between each other.
Approach.
And it's you now are the boss. What are you doing tomorrow morning?
Resign. I think the first thing that I would do is I would give much more autonomy to local authorities and let them start with the social housing. Okay, let's get that underway, full tilt. Like last year, we built less than 70. Like local authorities directly built fewer than 1,700 new homes. Right, there's 55,000 people out there. Now they did deliver, 6,500 overall through different mechanisms, but mostly relying on the private sector or on charities or, approved housing bodies. So I think that's the first one. There's, our approach to the crisis in the last 10 years has been, there's a paper published in America called For Every Housing Crisis, the solution is yet more luxury housing, right? And that's what we've done. Like we've started at the top with, luxury rental and expensive housing and trickle down economics, like outdated Reaganomics kind of stuff, in the hope that would all trickle down. Whereas really, if you want to solve the housing problem, you start at the bottom because that's where the real need is. And I don't mean just bleeding heart liberal need. I mean, actually, that's where the housing need is. We solve that problem, other things trickle up rather than trickle down, So I think that's where I'd go. So I'd get rid of the 4-stage process between local authorities and the Department of Housing. I would give much more, I'd let local authorities borrow money, and if they need to raise local property tax to fund that, that's fine with me. So I would do a whole lot of things to try and kind of temper. Now, this is a really, really tricky one, right? In an ideal world, what I would want, you don't want runaway house price inflation. Okay. And now that's a really hard thing because 2/3 of us are homeowners, down from 80% not that long ago, but 2/3 of us are homeowners and we don't really we're not comfortable. We know your kids can't afford a house because the house prices are going up, but yet on the other half of us we're going, the angel on the other shoulder is going, hey Lorcan, your house price has gone up, 100% in the last 5 years. So, it kind of means nothing in a way. Unless you borrow against it or unless you want to sell it, what it means is that in your will, that's how we transfer wealth in Ireland. It's not cash, it's our property.
I don't want to set you up here, so I'm going to tell you what I said in the introduction, which you haven't heard. Yeah. I have a strong belief that anybody who tells you what's happening with house prices in the short term is guessing or lying. Right? Now you could possibly have a very educated guess, and I respect that.
Guesswork. Yeah.
So where do you think? What's your projection? And I'm not going to hang you just to short term, but where do you think house prices will be in the medium to long term?
Well, government policy is all about maintaining and increasing the price of new housing. That's without a doubt, because the idea is that if we can help sustain the high price of new housing, more developers will supply housing. Okay. It's perverse. Yeah. It is absolutely perverse, but you can't predict what's going to happen. If someone asked, and I get this all the time, should I buy a house or not? That kind of stuff. And people in their late 30s and they're dying to settle down and, maybe start a family and do all the normal stuff, a bit of security for themselves at night time, emotional and mental security and financial security. And I kind of have come around to the conclusion that what's expensive today is cheap tomorrow, right? So if you want to buy a house, buy the damn house.
Yeah.
Without it, and you can afford it. And even if it means help to buy and shared equity, whatever, right? Which I don't agree with those policies because they're helping you pay more. You have to pay more money for the house. Either way, over the next 30, 40 years that you have that house, it's going to go up and it's going to go down. Okay, and it's look at the draw when you die or retire at the end, whether it's worth more or less than you paid for it, because it's economic cycles and all sorts of stuff that we have no control over. So if you can afford a house, don't gamble with it. Don't speculate on whether it's who cares if it's worth 20 grand more or it's 20 grand cheaper next year. Those 12 months that you've waited for it to go down 20 grand, you've spent it on rent or mental and emotional kind of instability. If you need the house, get the house.
Okay. Just to wrap up, and you weren't expecting this, but I was very heavily influenced by my dad based on what I do today. You mentioned your dad passed away. How long ago was that?
2008, a long time
2008.
Ago. Ironically, he worked for the Department of Environment.
That was my question.
Housing.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Was it him who led you into what you're doing today?
No, absolutely not. No, he was a civil servant, and for all his career, since he came up from a place called Williamstown in East Galway as soon as he could, and came up here and worked as a civil servant. I joined the civil service back in the day, and I lasted 6 weeks.
Okay. But he was in the Department of Housing, though, was he?
Yeah. No,
so there was chats around Sunday mornings around housing.
He was a HR guy, though. I lasted 6 weeks in the civil service. I couldn't, the job I have at the moment, a bit like yourself, I suppose, we have freedom, to do what we do and to think and to express ourselves, and nobody really says boo to us. The civil service is the opposite of all that, So I suppose,
in your opinion,
in my experience, and in my experience,
I'm just protecting my civil service listeners.
No. The civil service, the vast majority of civil servants, I find, are grand. At the top, you do get people who are quite, overly confident and sure about their opinion and that they're right and they're invariably wrong. I met my former boss actually at the McGill Summer School a few years ago, and she said hello to me, and I said, "Geez, she wouldn't let me do something, which is why I resigned." And she said, "Look at you now, aren't you doing grand?" So it's kind of the right thing to do, So I was happy enough with that.
Do you love what you do?
I think you couldn't probably, like everybody doing things, you get fed up with what you do as well. But you probably couldn't get a better job with the amount of freedom. I like freedom. Don't fence me in. That song. That's kind of played at my funeral. And so I have an awful lot of freedom, and I have very good support in work in terms of the management and work are very supportive of me. Nobody ever says you shouldn't have said that or you can't do that. Which is great.
Okay, Lorcan, I really appreciate you coming in.
Thanks,
Thanks for your knowledge, your time, and your experience.
Pleasure, Owen. Thanks.
Thank you.